to today's event, and we have a special visitor from Washington, D.C. via Beijing, Mr. John Frisbie. He's not on his way to Hangzhou as I initially thought. As you know, Hangzhou is hosting the G20 this weekend. Apparently, the city has received a major facelift of billions of dollars to look good on that occasion. But Mr. Frisbie, all the same, will brief us on the US-China relationship. Mr. Frisbie has been for more than 10 years in Beijing. He's been following this very important relationship for the last 30 years. He speaks fluent Mandarins, and he has been the head of the US-China Business Council for the last 12 years. So there should be no secret left for us at the end of this lunch about US-China. And please welcome John Frisbie.
Thank you for the introduction and for hosting. I'll try to live up to that last part of no secrets left regarding China when I'm done. I appreciate the opportunity to be out here and speak to the Hong Kong Foreign Correspondents Club. I always admired the building from the outside when I would be in Hong Kong, and am equally impressed by now being inside. Quite the institution you have here. I am based in Washington, D.C. US-China Business Council has offices in Beijing and Shanghai, and so I've been over last week in Beijing and then in Shanghai earlier this week before coming down here. I'm not going to assume you know who we are, but we are a private, nonprofit organization headquartered in Washington. We've been around for 40 plus years. We were started by a group of American companies right after President Nixon went to China, and it was felt like companies needed to have some entity to help them at least even understand where China was on the map probably at that point, or at least not literally, then figuratively in terms of trade. And so here we are, 40 plus years later, still going strong with 200 plus American companies as members, and still helping them on the one hand navigate the business environment in China, information and analysis. Hopefully it complements all the good work you do as well. And then, of course, the advocacy and policy work that you would expect us to do. We do that, of course, in Washington, where we're headquartered, but more importantly, our focus on the government in Beijing and to a certain extent in the provinces. For example, apart from my meetings in Beijing, when I was in Shanghai, I met with the Shanghai mayor, Mayor Yang, and that tends to be the level that we engage at. Pretty good access. We have a board of directors that is global CEO level. Our current chair is the CEO of the Ford Motor Company, Mark Field. So we're a small organization, but we can punch above our weight, as I like to think. I thought I would take your time up today talking about a couple of things, and then if things go another direction to try to reveal all the secrets about China, then we will perhaps go US-China. Okay, that's an easier set of secrets to divulge. But I would like to say a few things about how American companies are viewing the business environment in China. We do an annual survey of our membership, and we released that, I think, I'm losing track of where I am and where I've been and when, but I think it was last week we released that, and the slides that came out of that are easily found on our website. But cover that ground, and then I think it ties into the activities this week in Hangzhou, which include, of course, both the G20, as well as of more interest to me in my role, the bilateral summit between President Obama and President Xi Jinping. So, from our survey, I would say there's a couple of areas of key takeaways, as it were, that I would highlight. On the operating side, China's economic slowdown is clearly having an impact on companies. It's impacting revenue growth, but bear in mind what I'm saying there is growth. Growth is slowing. But 2/3 of our companies are still projecting revenue growth this year. So it's a slowdown from where it was. How that's impacting companies, China's not a monolith, as you know. It really depends on the sector you're in, but if you're in, infrastructure or materials, you're probably seeing a lot of pressure there. If you're in sectors tied to the consumer or healthcare, you're seeing pretty good growth still. But that slowdown is impacting companies on their revenue top line. And in addition to that, American companies are seeing, and this is a development that's really come up in the last 2 or 3 years to the extent it is, competition with Chinese companies is intensifying. Chinese companies are getting better, and it used to be that the top competitor for an American company in China was probably another multinational, and that may still be the case, but the real competitive development coming up that companies are paying attention to is Chinese companies. And it's the #1 challenge in our survey this year, in our top 10, if you will. It's that way for companies when you roll them up all together, but when you break it down by, say, services sector companies, competition from Chinese companies is #1, or technology companies, Chinese company competition #1 as well. And in my discussions in Beijing and Shanghai, I probably talked to about 25 senior executives in small sessions and engaged with another 75 beyond that. That was clearly the thing I was hearing most about. And what that's doing to the landscape. Companies remain profitable. I think something like 90% of the survey respondents said they're profitable in China, and that's been pretty much that way over the last decade, somewhere between 85 and 90%. So that's a notable figure. But that increasing competition, plus the rising costs in China that I'm sure you're familiar with over the last 5, 6, 7 years, are combining to, along with overcapacity in some sectors, squeeze margins. So 90% profitable, but they're finding that their profitability margin rates are getting squeezed. 2/3 still say that the margins in China are the same as or better than their company has globally, so I think that context is important, but 1/3 of them are saying their margins in China are below what their company does globally, and that's also something that is developing. I think this is flowing through and having an impact in terms of the broader landscape for American companies in China. It's no longer about building capacity. If you went back 5 years ago, the biggest restraint on growth for our membership in China was their capacity to serve the market. So if you were a manufacturer, yes, it's your widget making capacity, but that's not the only way I mean it. If you were a services company, could you hire people fast enough? If you were a retailer, could you build stores fast enough? In other words, your ability to have what the customer wanted was your biggest restraint on growth. It's that way still for some companies and some sectors that are in that growth mode even now, but for a lot of companies, things are changing. With the slower revenue growth, with the rising competition that I mentioned, with the need to go to Tier 3 and Tier 4 cities to get growth now, it's no longer being in the big cities on the coast. All that is, one, leading to a more complicated commercial footprint that you have to manage. You're now seeing companies much more focused on controlling costs, improving efficiencies, controlling headcount, and even reducing headcount, which you never saw before, and slowing investment. And so that's a very different environment now. In many ways, it's a more mature economy, because these are things you would see companies doing in other environments. I think China's 1 foot in that category and still 1 foot in a growth category that's not up to more internationally mature markets. But we're clearly seeing that as a new and important development for American companies that are operating in China versus, say, 5 years ago. It's about distinguishing whatever your product or service is in terms of its value to the customer, and making sure that you've got something in China for China, no longer bringing maybe what you do overseas to China and selling it, and that'll be okay. Competition and consumer tastes, customer tastes are driving companies to have to modify what their offering is, again, as you would expect. And I think that reaction that I mentioned earlier about cutting costs and controlling headcount and slowing investment is a normal reaction too in a slowing market. But nonetheless, something very different from 5 years ago. China remains a priority market, so companies are not pulling out. We just don't see our membership doing that much at all. I've always said there's 2 kinds of foreign investors in China. One would be, and this was amongst the first wave, companies that invested in China as an export platform, basically, bringing in materials and exporting a finished product. So it was, low cost of labor that was assembling things at the end, right? It was lai liao jia gong in Chinese. For companies like that, the strengthening renminbi, the cost increases, the wage increases, I think you've seen it here and you're aware of that already. If they are impacted by that, they probably started moving to the next low-cost location anyway. That tends not to be American companies. We source from a lot of those companies, but they tend to be other Asian companies that we've sourced from over time when they were in Taiwan or Japan or Korea or anywhere else. And I've often said, when I'm back in the United States, look at the television set in your living room. It's a Sony, let's say, and if you flip it around, and on the back, 10 or 15 years ago, it said made in Japan, and probably for the last 5 or 10 years, it said made in China. It's still a Sony, but they moved that production to China. For companies, like I say, that are sensitive to those cost increases, but have primarily used China as an export platform, yeah, maybe they've gone to Vietnam or somewhere else. Most American companies, for their own direct investments in China, however, are focused on the China market. And for them, that's the reason to be there. And so despite these developments, or with these developments, they are simply adapting and figuring out how to continue to try to be able to access that market. So that's one set of important takeaways if you have if you're in a business, to understand what's going on the ground. But the second takeaway from our survey that I'd point to is the continuation of policy uncertainty in the American business community about where China is heading with its economic reforms. And I would say that this is undermining confidence as well about how they view the market. So in that survey, I think it's slide number 5, if you were to go look at it, we ask a question every time about how our members view the next 5 years. So in essence, it's the 5-year outlook for companies. This year in our survey, I think, and the answer could be optimistic, somewhat optimistic, neutral, somewhat pessimistic, pessimistic. This year, 72% were optimistic or somewhat optimistic. 72%, that's a pretty good number. I think most of us would like to have that anywhere for anything we're doing. But the catch is that's the lowest percentage in the 10 years we've been doing the survey. So a little bit of a nuanced answer here. It's not like pessimism reigns. It doesn't. I mean, pessimism remains, I think if you wrap up both categories, 10% or something like that, and it's not any different between our survey or those of the AmChams up in China as well. But I would clearly say it's moderating optimism, but more importantly, I would say I think it reflects softening confidence. And this is a message that we have clearly delivered to senior officials in the Chinese government. It's one that I know President Xi himself is fully aware of. There's a couple of drivers to that sentiment right now. Yes, the market slowdown, I would expect, has entered into it the last year or so, because this is, after all, a 5-year outlook, and results and market conditions will matter. But I think the more important driver of that sentiment, and we have a drill-down question that gets at this, is that there's been little impact from China's economic reforms so far on the issues that matter to American companies. And I would probably also extend that and say probably to other foreign companies as well, for that matter. We're in year 3 of the new reform program, and yes, there have been some moves forward in certain areas, but on this area of the economy, generally, and particularly how it impacts foreign companies or American companies, very little impact so far. We run a economic reform scorecard, as a matter of fact, and I think we update it a couple times a year, been doing so for at least a couple of years. And we show that the dial has hardly moved in terms of impact, still limited. I think we're going to issue it the next couple of weeks, another update. There are some steps forward in some areas that are having some positive impact, but then there's other areas where it's going the other direction. But you add it all up, and despite the pronouncements coming into office 3 years ago, so far there hasn't been a lot of impact yet. That, I think, is undermining confidence, which is reflected in that chart I showed you. And even though it's not pessimism, it is clearly showing up when you look at it. So I think that the way I view that lack of confidence is not in growth over the long term in China. I think companies understand that as the economy matures there, you're going to have slowing growth. They are in a transition, and it's showing some effects already. But I think it's the uncertainty about whether American companies will be able to access that growth as fully as they should. Even at reduced GDP growth, and we were talking about this earlier up in our conversation during lunch, China's delivering more to global growth than any other economy, including the U.S., and it has been for a few years. I think something, like a third of global GDP growth every year is coming out of China. The U.S. has been more, the 20-25% of that. China's real GDP added last year at 6.5% or whatever it was more than 12% added a decade ago, again, because the base has gotten so much bigger. And at 5.5% growth over the next decade, let's say, China would add 2 Germanys to its economy or 4 Indias. So that's important context to have. We, probably about 2 or 3 weeks ago, also issued something we do every year, and this is directed at a U.S. audience, and it's important during this election season. We, every year, show exports to China by each U.S. state to try to localize this, not just roll it all up, but there's so much interest outside of Washington and in every U.S. state about the impact of China, and you can clearly see rapid growth in exports to China over the last, 15 years since they joined the WTO, for example. And it shows up in every state's exports just about, and China's now a top 3 exporter for almost, something like 35 states or something like that, or $1 billion in exports for 35 states. I don't remember what the number is exactly. Clearly an important market to the United States and pretty much throughout the country. The other big revelation that came out of this year's export report, though, was the growth in services exports to China, which has been pretty small for a while, but now it's suddenly at $42 billion. Goods exports were around $115 billion. China's now, I think, the 4th largest services export market for the U.S. So, this is starting to be meaningful. You add them up, and you're getting an economy that obviously has a very real economic interest in the United States. But as I mentioned, there is a transition going on here, too, that shows up in the numbers. Goods exports tailed off the last couple of years, and I think that reflects, the economic slowdown. But even in China's own economic numbers for the first half of the year, we can see those transitions showing up, because China's not a monolith, and you know it out here better than we see it back in the U.S., but by region, the Rust Belt in the northeast and the north-central part of China was probably more or less recession. You can pick your number for what growth might have been, but the other 25 for whatever provinces did pretty well. By company type, state-owned sector, negative profits for I don't know how long this has been going on, many months in a row, if not years. And then private sector profits continuing to grow. And again, a transition that probably wouldn't be necessarily noticed unless one dug into it. And then certainly by sector, like I mentioned before, with the consumer and consumer-driven segments holding up pretty well, and as opposed to what's going on with infrastructure and basic industry or manufacturing. All that, again, I think reflecting by and large a slowdown that's been managed by the government. So I don't think there's too many questions in the minds of American companies about China's growth in the future. Like I say, I think the more important question is, will American companies be able to access that growth as fully as they should? And that's where the uncertainty comes in. It's also where the policy environment comes in, and it ties to the meetings this weekend. I think for the U.S.-China Business Council, one of the reasons we've been pushing a high-standard bilateral investment treaty between the U.S. and China is precisely that it would touch upon a lot of what these policy uncertainties are all about. And I think the other thing that it does is that it ties very directly into the reform debate in China as well, and whether that's going to move forward or not, the uncertainties around that. So this weekend we've got the G20 leaders in Hangzhou, President Obama amongst them. As I said, my greater interest is in that bilateral part of it as opposed to the multilateral. President Obama and President Xi will have what I would call a summit for the 4th year in a row, which I think is great. Our organization has been calling for an annual presidential summit involving the U.S. and Chinese presidents for several years now. We were pleased when they did it 4 years ago. We've been very pleased they've done it every year since. We think it's important for that to continue, whoever comes into office as well, by the way. But I think to that point, it's important to show that these summits do matter. which was part of what I was up in Beijing doing in terms of our own advocacy with senior Chinese officials as well. So they will have their bilateral summit, if you will, on Saturday before the G20 starts. I reckon about a half a day, and my understanding is a dinner. And if you think about it, with 19 or so other heads of state in town, the fact that President Xi is going to take that kind of time out to meet with President Obama, I think is sending a pretty significant signal. It's certainly sending a signal about how China views the importance of the U.S. relationship. You know, certainly President Obama's in his last 4 or 5 months in office, and I think, you know, it would have been easy perhaps for China not to devote as much time to this meeting, but I was hearing it during the springtime, and now they do feel like they want to try to get as much done as they can with President Obama, the president they know, as opposed to whoever might be coming in, before the transition occurs. So a pretty good amount of time together, maybe not as long as in some cases the 18 hours they've had at previous ones, but nonetheless, as I say, a important carve-out of time with a lot of other heads of state in town. Priorities, certainly for our organization, and I think what you'll see on the economic side of whatever it is they come out with, and there will be a joint statement, as there often is, and of course that's under negotiation now, and will continue to be under negotiation, I think, until September 2nd, I would guess. But the bilateral investment treaty, I think, will be high on the economic agenda. A year ago, when President Xi was in Washington, and they came out into the Rose Garden of the White House after their discussions, the bilateral investment treaty was the first thing each one of them talked about. And I don't just mean on the economic side, I mean first thing, period. And I think that's going to probably happen again. I think that enough progress has been made on those negotiations, perhaps quietly, in the last 12 months, but in particular over the summer when things were accelerated, that those negotiations are going to continue no matter what. They're going to put some kind of a marker on it on Saturday to the best they can, depending on how things go this week. But I think we'll see those negotiations continue, which is a reflection of the fact that both sides, but certainly the U.S. side as well, feels like enough has been done, and China has put and made enough progress in terms of what is put on the table to warrant continuing these discussions to the end of the year. We'll see how much more they can say than that when they issue their statement. But if they, for example, announce a year-end date as a target, I think that means they probably made even more progress. So we'll see where that goes, but I think that's going to be high on the agenda. I think there's an array of what I would call information technology security type issues that you all are familiar with that will be discussed. I'm not sure how much will end up in a joint statement, but in essence, these are things that range from China's draft cybersecurity law, for example, or in regulations that impact insurance industry technology. It gets pretty detailed, but they basically fall into two buckets. One, things that would block market access for vendors of IT goods and technologies, American vendors, so that they're not being, at least for government purchases and maybe large state-owned enterprise purchases, allowed to even have an opportunity to sell, ostensibly for national security purposes. But it also impacts users of technology. So it's not just an IT sector set of issues. Companies ranging from manufacturing to financial services to healthcare, all are impacted by whether there are mandates to use local technologies in your operations in China, on the one hand, that may or may not mesh with global systems and therefore would be less secure, but also impact data flows. If there are going to be attempts to not allow data to flow across the border, that impacts a lot of normal company operations. Healthcare companies, where big data analysis is important. You can't have a center for that in every country you operate. But even manufacturers of equipment who might use a remote monitoring station to evaluate how well a piece of equipment is performing in a power plant or somewhere else. So very practical operating impact from what is probably thought of as purely a national security type objective, but very important and impacting American companies. Those issues are being discussed. I don't know how much of them will end up as well and what might be said. I think we'll hear about cybersecurity and whatever comes out in the joint statement. It'll probably be more related to the espionage aspect of cybersecurity than anything else, and a dialogue that's been going on since President Xi visited last year than those issues I mentioned. But for us, the focus is on the issues that I described, and we'll continue to be engaging on that. Something that will probably fall in the G20 umbrella that will be important to companies. There's other things, obviously, the G20 will discuss, but something that will have a direct impact on many operating companies, I think will be a signal that there will be an attempt to conclude the World Trade Organization Environmental Goods Agreement. Don't go to sleep, don't go to sleep. I mean, this is really, really important. Environmental Goods Agreement by the end of the year, and they'll identify areas to be negotiated. This is the kind of thing that probably doesn't matter so much to you, but it does matter to the companies because it impacts a lot of companies who sell related goods, related technologies. This would lower tariffs. It's a multilateral agreement, a WTO agreement. It's been negotiated for some time. There are, I don't remember how many countries involved, maybe 40 plus, but don't quote me on that one. So this would have a real meaningful impact. I suspect it's going to be under the G20 umbrella that they will announce that intent to get that done by the end of the year, and that would be, like I say, a nice practical outcome. There's other things that the two presidents will discuss. I'm certain that overcapacity issues in China will be on the agenda. I'm not sure how much of that will end up in a statement, but the market distortions of overcapacity, whether it's steel or coal, but even aluminum, chemicals, and so on, are something that I know will be discussed between, at that level between the two presidents. I would go back again and say that I think these annual summits do matter. The last 2 years have shown that, I think, in terms of outcomes. China is at least a $400 billion market for U.S. companies now. It's the second largest overseas market for U.S. companies, tied with Mexico after Canada. Canada's about an $800 billion market. Mexico and China are about a $400 billion market. That's adding up what we export to China. It's adding up what American companies based in China sell. It's eliminating overlaps. But it's significant. So the U.S. economic interest in the relationship is real. I think it's as important as the other interests we have in the relationship on the strategic side. It's important that China remain high on the list of priorities for the remaining months, I think, of this administration, as well as for the next president. I think the idea here is to show, as I said, that these summits matter. One thing that I think China is really very concerned about is the political transition. The strongest message I can give to them is that if you're trying to influence those coming in, right now is the time to show that engagement does produce results. Engagement between presidents produce results as well. So we'll see what happens this weekend. I'm getting the hook, so I'm going to stop right there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Do you want to stay there? I think you can stay there. Yes, to take as you like. Okay, well, yeah, I see lots of questions. If I could just take the privilege of being here to ask the first one with the what if, in the case of the election, the view from your community. What if and what if?
So the question is,
how does your community, business community,
view the U.S. election?
With China, depending on who is next the president?
Well, it may not seem like it, but it's still early days in the U.S. election. Feels like it's been going on for a long time, and I think that's because it has been going on for a long time. And yet, we still got, what, 2.5 months to go, or close to it. And we are definitely in the phase of the election where it's the politics of getting elected that drives everything. So I throw that out there as an important thing to keep in mind, that what we hear now, because it is focused on winning on November 7th, 8th, whatever it is, will be different from what we hear after that. And then it becomes the responsibility of governing, and it's more about the policy. Having said that, when China has come up in the campaign so far, it's been wholly negative, just like it has been in other cycles before this. So in that respect, I would say it's not different. Certainly in the U.S., the campaign rhetoric around trade writ large is different than we've heard in the past, however. So we'll see how that plays out. The interesting thing, too, and I think this ties back to what I said about we're still in front of the election, so I don't know how much we can take in terms of cues for what happens afterwards. When the candidates talk about China, they don't even mention the strategic side of the relationship at all. I think when the South China Sea, when the arbitration case from the Philippines was announced, there might have been a statement from one or the other saying, we hope it's enforced or something like that, but that's been it. Scant little on that side of the relationship. And on the one hand, it speaks to give us a reminder about how the world looks when you step back, and the Middle East and South Asia are far more acute and demand far more attention at the top than the Asia-Pacific issues do, and I think that's likely to continue. Yes, China is the rising, I think, strategic issue of the future, but for now, of course, the issues around the Middle East are the ones that will continue, I think, to get most of the attention. And so when you hear candidates talking right now, I think that's the case. So when China's come up, it's been on the trade side primarily. And why is that? Well, it ties, and they tie it back to jobs. And jobs matter in a U.S. election. And so again, I throw that out there. This is about trying to win in early November. On the trade rhetoric, of course, we've had one candidate, Mr. Trump, talk about early on a 45% tariff on all imports coming in from China. And I think that was a talking point from 5 and 10 years ago when there was currency legislation in Congress, and that was deemed to be the fix. I think subsequently he's stopped saying that particular 45% on all imports from China to talking more about tariffs in selected sectors. But we'll see. I mean, as what might truly evolve afterwards, we don't know. I will say that if he wanted to put tariffs on, he actually has the powers to do so. Some people have wondered whether he could. The president does have the power to put tariffs on without congressional approval, so there would be that avenue. Maybe not on day one, and maybe not on day 5, but pretty quickly. There's not a rigorous process that's laid out under U.S. trade law, so it is possible. But I would again caution that once someone gets into office and they look at the range of responsibilities that go with policy actions, we'll see how that comes out. Both candidates have talked about using tariffs perhaps in areas like steel, which is not a surprise. That's where anti-dumping cases exist now. Will there be something more than that? We'll have to see.
I don't know if you saw Keir Gibbs's piece in the South China Morning Post today, chairman of the American Chamber in Shanghai, talking about specifically market access in China and the conditions under which American business people operate. And I'd like to hear your thoughts on that. I do have a follow-up question on G20, though. Is there the possibility, or will there be an opportunity at this summit for the leaders to talk about the European community slapping Apple with a $13 billion euro tax bill?
I will pass in a second, just because that's not in my area of expertise, or there's nothing I can add to that that would be of any value. In terms of market access, I'm going to come back to the bilateral investment treaty. I think that's the big part of what makes that agreement so important to American companies. One, market access, but the other one is also the level playing field. And it does that, it addresses each of those in the following ways. China entered the WTO 15 years ago in December, and that agreement opened up many, many sectors in China that had not been opened before, but only went so far. And in essence, I view the bilateral investment treaty as picking up on the unfinished business from China's WTO entry and potentially opening those remaining sectors. Those sectors have barriers in them, if you will, or market access barriers through a couple of different means. On the one hand, ownership limits for foreign investors, including American investors, that touch upon 100 different segments of the Chinese economy. They're in manufacturing. If you think about, say, automobiles, 50% foreign ownership cap is one example. Services sectors, if you think about financial services, cloud computing, 50% cap. They're in agriculture too. So they've been there for a long time. That's really the ultimate goal that the U.S.-China Business Council is going toward when we advocate for a bilateral investment treaty. It's not really the treaty as an end in itself. It's as a means to get at those ownership barriers, which in essence are market access barriers, as Kerr was probably alluding to. The level playing field issues will be helped by the national treatment provisions of a bilateral investment treaty. So if it's high standard, it should address both. And it would extend to things like, say, discriminatory licensing, which is another way that companies can be limited in their market access. So, an American insurance company may, in, say, auto insurance, be able to own 100%. Doesn't have a cap on it like, say, life insurance does. But if you have to get licensed one branch at a time, it's a really onerous process that takes a lot of time. In the meantime, you can see your competitors getting multiple licenses at the same time. So that's why that bilateral investment treaty, I think, would address probably the one instrument that would address the biggest group of those things. It wouldn't solve them all. But otherwise, there are a lot of sort of one-offs that would have to be taken on one by one. This is an instrument that would at least give a better opportunity to address those concerns through one agreement.
Thank you.
A quick question, roughly in what time frame do you see this bilateral investment treaty completed?
Well, I think both sides have said that they would like to get it done by the end of this year, before the end of the Obama administration, if possible. And that's been driving the accelerated negotiations over the last year. Can they do that? I'm not going to put odds on it, but I would say that the prospects for doing so are wholly dependent on whether China can overcome the lack of consensus on reforms and openings and put forward that kind of high standard agreement that I mentioned. Will they be able to open up a lot of these sectors that remain closed right now? Will they agree to the national treatment provisions or not? If they're willing to be aggressive on that front, then the Obama administration is willing to finish negotiations of the deal. So the spotlight is on China's ability to meet the high standard required to get an agreement supported by, one, the U.S. business community and our organization, the U.S.-China Business Council, but then also be able to be ratified by the U.S. Senate, which wouldn't happen this year in either case. And both sides are clear about that. They're talking about completing negotiations between the two governments, if you will. But for the U.S., there's another process that requires ratification by the U.S. Senate. Not the entire Congress. It's different from something like, say, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, but by the U.S. Senate. That's going to be left down the road.
If TPP doesn't pass, what happens? If it does pass, is it valuable for locking China into certain universal trade? What is the U.S. Business Council's position on that? And what do you think is going to happen?
Well, you know, China isn't part of TPP, even though it is. It isn't because it's not one of the countries, of course, involved in it, but it is because it's being used as the foil as a reason to vote for TPP if you're a congressman or woman in the United States. My hope is that TPP will pass because, number one, I think it's a high standard agreement, and I think it does set out a bar that many in China would like to see China then therefore have to meet. So I think it could be a support mechanism for furthering reforms in China, same thing like a bilateral investment treaty would. So you know, that right there is reason enough to do it. There's obviously the U.S. presence in Asia that I think the Obama administration has pinned a lot of their advocacy on, and you know, we'll see how all that goes. I give you the caveat, since China's not a part of it, I'm not deeply involved in, you know, the effort to try to get TPP passed. So, you know, all I will say is that the president has put into motion a process whereby he wants to get a vote on it after the election, but before he leaves office, the so-called lame duck period. But on the other hand, you've got, yes, further on, two presidential candidates, so assuming one of them actually wins, who both said that they wouldn't support it. In the lame duck period, therefore, it really depends on, I think, whether it can be brought up for a vote and whether it will get enough votes. And I think, you know, most of the Washington wisdom on this is that it's uncertain. You've got some key leadership in Congress who, going back several months, said they were dissatisfied with certain aspects of it, Senate Majority Leader being one of them, and nothing's been done on that. So how that plays into what happens during the lame duck period, I don't know. You know, they don't have a lot of bandwidth then. I think they're in session for 4 weeks with other things on the table. So, you know, all I would say, it could be challenging. But I will again say what I said earlier. Once you get past November 7th or 8th, we'll see what the landscape is like. But certainly in advance of the election, you know, it's very uncertain what will happen with that agreement.
You talked about this survey of U.S. companies in China. I'm wondering about whether the U.S. Chamber of Commerce have done surveys about Chinese investments going to the U.S. And what is the general sentiment of U.S. companies about this trend, about Chinese companies' investments and their, you know, value to the U.S. economy? And second part of the question is, you mentioned a map of U.S. states tracking these trends. Have you seen certain states that are more supportive of Chinese investments and certain states that are less supportive, and why?
On the latter, no, I haven't seen states where they haven't been interested in having Chinese investment come in. Governors and mayors are here come to China all the time seeking inbound investment, just like they like inbound investment from anywhere in the world. Why? Creates jobs, economic growth, expands the tax base. You want to keep your economy vitalized and revitalized, and that's what foreign investment does. So I think that's a strong view held outside the Beltway, if you will, outside of Washington, D.C. As far as surveys of Chinese investors, the best ones I saw were actually done by a Chinese organization called the China Council for Promotion of International Trade. I don't think they've done it for 2 or 3 years, but they did 2 years in a row a survey of Chinese investors and how they viewed outbound investment in various markets around the world. The U.S. was a favored destination of interest anyway. This is before we saw the tangible growth in investment over the last couple of years. But they had uncertainties about how to operate in the environment and so on. It had less to do with whether they were welcomed or not, but it was just a different legal environment and one that they weren't used to with different rules. And understanding that environment was the biggest impediment. I think what we've seen, of course, is an uptick in investment from Chinese companies into the United States. I think amongst our board of directors membership, that is largely welcomed. Opportunities for partnership, if you will. I think there's a feeling that bringing China into other environments also helps to perhaps have some influence back here because of best practices they learn or different ways of governance that they might encounter. So it's all part of perhaps bringing China more into the international system that I think gets support more broadly or generally. But I think behind your question is another important thought. And we've seen this developing over time. China's had these barriers on foreign and American company ownership in China, going back to when they first opened up. They've got far less of them now than they had then, but nonetheless, they still have them, like I said, 100 different segments. As an aside, be that as it may, I think something like 3/4 of foreign investment and American investment into China these days is still in 100% foreign-owned facilities. So, where they have controls is in a smaller segment of the investment, but in important areas that would be meaningful. Chinese companies going to the U.S. generally don't face those kinds of barriers. So, as Chinese companies are increasingly investing in the United States, you will find companies who have to compete with them there saying, well, wait a minute, when it was all just about us investing in China and we couldn't invest there as fully as we could and we had to compete, that was one thing. But if those Chinese companies have protections in their market, yet they can now come over here and compete with me in my market, then yes, there's an imbalance there. I wouldn't overstate that at the moment, but that view is clearly there. It's been our view for some time as a reason to try to leverage back with the Chinese government for why they should start reducing ownership barriers. And I think we're going to see these issues come more and more to the forefront and get more and more attention and hopefully drive more pressure for change in China as we go along.
Take you a little bit further on what you've just been talking about. Some of these members who are all multinational executives have reported, and partly because of the slowdown in business and everything you've said, is that they feel that there's more of a barrier in China these days than there was, say, even a year or a year and a half ago. And the Chinese retort, and although you said rightfully so, the U.S. is more open, there are some Chinese companies that have had problems with CFIUS and so on, Huawei, of course, most dramatically. Yep. But even Maytag was rejected at one point, maybe on national security issues that I don't quite understand. What kind of feedback are you getting these days? Is there a change, or is that just looking for excuses to try to defend slower business?
Well, I always think context matters, and is it the worst business environment in 30 years? I don't know. I mean, 30 years ago, China might have been a $10 or $15 billion market for U.S. companies, and now it's $400 billion. So, we don't want to just blow past that. But the difference is that China is a much bigger economy now. It has much more impact globally, not just 30 years ago, but even arguably 5 years ago, China didn't show up much in earnings reports in Wall Street or earnings calls, and it does now. So the stakes are higher. Yeah, American companies, China's an important market, but as I said earlier, it's not as important as it could be, or U.S. companies cannot participate in that market as fully as they would like to because of the various barriers or other things that they encounter. So that sentiment is in that chart I mentioned that shows, I think, that sagging confidence. I don't think we should ignore that, yeah, slowdown probably has a piece of that too. But I think we've seen this reflected pretty much from all voices these days. The European Chamber has certainly voiced that. The AmChams in China as well have voiced that, and our organization, of course, has voiced it too. So we'll see where this all evolves. We do have a period of transitions coming up on both sides of the Pacific Ocean. We know about the political transition coming up in the United States with the election. But China's got a transition of some sort coming up a year from now, in October or November for their party Congress. That will be, I think, important. As you know, that translates into government leadership changes 6 months after that in March of 2018. Based on age limits, 3 of the 4 vice premiers will step down, for example, or should step down. And there's going to be a lot of other, I think, signals that will come out of that might tell us if we can anticipate more ambitious movement ahead on reforms that would have openings. And I think that's a central question I put out there, as well as to senior Chinese officials. Will there be reforms and openings, or will there be reforms without openings? Is it going to be 改革开放 or 改革不开放? And that's the question I think American companies have on their minds. And it ties back to the question earlier about Chinese companies operating in the U.S. and their desire to have access to that market. You'd like to think there's some common interests here that would help overcome some of the policy barriers. We'll see what happens. We've got a lot of political events that are going to impact that in the next 2 years.
Well, I guess that's a great question to finish with. Thank you very much for this clear and complete overview. And I'll give you a little souvenir from the FCC.
All secrets revealed, right?
Sorry?
All secrets revealed, right?
You will?
All secrets were revealed. And again, thank you very much.